Hi, today is Monday, the 4th of September 2023. It's 26 degrees outside, and I'm going to be reading 7 A3 sheets. So, this is corporate sabotage number 3, bearing false witness, and it's about M-Seeker of Truth and Centrepoint and the ongoing cover-up. M-Seeker of Truth is a made-up name. M-Seeker of Truth calls himself M-Seeker of Truth, M-Seeker, space, of truth, and M. M-Seeker of Truth is a little man who is dangerous and a dangerous liar. He gets everything wrong. As the saying goes, be aware of the little man. M-Seeker of Truth lived in New Zealand for 20 years or so. According to his own confession, he developed a deep sarcasm in New Zealand. M is a short Britisher with hilarious eyebrows that look like the window wipers of an East European Trabant and wander all over the place in the same manner. Bad design, wrong intent. M has no qualifications, and his entire job history in New Zealand and the UK appears to be wiping the asses of mental patients. This was actually his confession. It is often hard to tell the difference between the patients and the staff in mental institutions, and a bit of it rubbed off onto M-Seeker of Truth and his hilarious eyebrows. M-Seeker of Truth's lack of qualifications, low-end jobs, and shortness left him with a great potential for envy. As an extremely short man, this left M with a great potential for sabotage, and he found his slot snapping at the heels of lions. So the unnamed envious little man enlisted with the New Zealand government as a narc in the I will do anything category, even if overseas. When the little man with the Trabant window wiper eyebrows couldn't get a job more than wiping mental patients' asses in New Zealand, he returned to Britain and did the same. It was in Britain that M-Seeker of Truth was called into corporate sabotage and took on the identity of M-Seeker of Truth, thus continuing his unnamed status. M also stands for midget and MI5. M-Seeker of Truth is more appropriately M-Avoider of Truth, avoider of truth at all costs and funded according to his avoidance of truth. M gets everything wrong whenever he is talking about his primary target. Greg Hallett was the primary target, that's myself. M got everything wrong about Greg Hallett. Greg Hallett should have been the hero of the story, having exposed Centrepoint as a government operation in 2007, 2008, 2009, and 2010. But M-Seeker of Truth is a corporate saboteur working for heroin traffickers and pedophiles who are involved in instigating and perpetuating Centrepoint and then stealing all their land and selling it with 400 houses on it for $200 million with $100 million in profit. So the heroin traffickers and pedophiles who started Centrepoint had enough money to fund corporate sabotage against anyone who exposed this Jesuit land grab con. M-Seeker of Truth was a corporate saboteur attacking Greg Hallett, who had exposed the heroin trafficking and pedophilia of Roger Douglas. Roger Douglas was behind Centrepoint, as published in 2007 and 2008 in a book and in the newspapers. M does not give his real name or address because he's hiding his shame, having sex with mental patients, rendering him catch and release and forcing him to leave New Zealand. M-Seeker of Truth appears to have been given permission to use a fake identity to attack, defame, and get everything wrong about any truther who has exposed his heroin trafficking sponsors as a heroin trafficker and his pedophile sponsors as pedophiles. The role of the unnamed, no address, no friends, corporate saboteur M is to attack the truth, support the lies, and protect the pedophiles and heroin traffickers that fund him. M is a compulsive liar working for corporate sabotage for pedophiles and heroin traffickers and interviews their secretaries in support. M-Seeker of Truth did a series of interviews, and they were people Greg Hallett, myself, had nothing to do with for the last 4 or 5 decades, and with good reason. M-Seeker of Truth interviewed Richard Marshall, born 1960, who now appears gay. Roger Douglas, born 1937, now aged 85, was a heroin trafficker and pedophile behind Centrepoint in 1978, who founded ACT New Zealand in 1994. This political party became known as ACT in 1994 and made it to Parliament 2008 to 2011. Richard Marshall was a secretary for ACT. Rodney Hyde was the first chairman and president of ACT. I was in at the time, getting briefed by the New Zealand Security Intelligence Service and Internal Affairs 4 times a week for 7 years, 2002 to 2009, so over 1,000 briefings, which kind of means I know what I'm talking about, which is why all my information stands up in court. New Zealand Security Intelligence Service, or SIS, was the equivalent of MI6, and Internal Affairs was the equivalent of MI5. They were briefing me because I had told them stories of myself overseas, and they had checked them, found 90% of them to be true, and the other 10% they couldn't check. This made me a person of interest, a POI, for intelligence. The SIS wrote in my dog file, "If you give this man any money, he will take over the world." Judges took heed of this and never let me get a payout in court again. So from 1993 on. I was having lunch in the Benson Road Deli in Remuera in the posh area of central Auckland. Axe number 1, Rodney Hyde, came over and sat at my table. We had a chat. Rodney then briefed 2 industrialists for 5 or 10 minutes, then brought them over to sit at my table where I briefed them. They expressed their concern because they knew a lot of the stories were true themselves. Sad for New Zealand. Next page. Page 2. Rodney Hyde was the first ranked in the ACT Party, and soon after our meeting he won Epsom in central Auckland in November 2008. One of the ACT Party secretaries was Richard Marshall, a year ahead of myself at school. When M-Seeker of Truth put out that he wanted people to talk about Greg Hallett, ACT Party Secretary Richard Marshall put up his hand. It was Secretary Richard Marshall's role to cover up for the ACT Party leaders, even when they were pedophiles, heroin traffickers, and behind the founding of the commune Centrepoint, which Greg Hallett had exposed as a government operation between 2007 and 2010. They did not want it known that Centrepoint was a government psyops, a psychological operation using methods 2.5 to 3 years ahead of the high street. The commune Centrepoint grew out of the OHAL. OHAL plots of land were not fertile enough, not commercial in size, lacked water, had difficult access, or were too remote or too hot in summer, etc. OHAL were useless land given to hippies to camp out on, then building timber structures, often out of unmilled timber. Out of these grew Centrepoint in Albany, just outside Auckland, in 1978. Centrepoint was different in that it was 100 acres of fertile land with its own stream and water source, and Auckland City was growing out towards it. So what originally cost New Zealand dollars 200,000 in 1978 became 100 million in land 1998 to 2008. The government wanted Centrepoint in 20 to 30 years' time, so they delayed their public execution of Centrepoint until 1992-93, stole the 100 acres which really belonged to the members, and placed Centrepoint in the public trust for 5 to 15 years until it reached maximum value. This also under-resourced the Centrepoint members, who left with nothing except for those that made pedophile claims. They got £50,000 each. As a result, some of those who made claims were not victims, and some of those who were named were not pedophiles. Still, the New Zealand government had 100 million in land, and they had just completed a Tavistock-style psyops with none of their government agents being named or exposed. That is, Minister of Broadcasting and then Minister of Finance Roger Douglas, and President of the Law Society in 1987 Peter Williams QC, and the rotating 4 Internal Affairs agents and 1 Security Intelligence Service agent were all protecting the asset, the land of Centrepoint, which they considered to be their land. Prime Minister Rob Muldoon, 1975 to 84, had motivation for this, as he was Britain's Tavistock. He was trained in Britain's Tavistock May 1945 to January 1946, returning to New Zealand in March 1946, and he was accountant for the heroin trafficker Marty Johnston, who was trafficking heroin with Terry Clark, who was run by Peter Williams QC, later became QC. All this heroin was targeted at me, by the way, and in the same area I lived in, the North Shore, 1968 to 75, going to Westlake and Takapuna, and then in Tauranga. And when I moved to Tauranga, the centre of heroin trafficking moved to Tauranga Harbour and law officers overlooking Tauranga Harbour. Terry Clark ended up killing Marty Johnston when he was 28 in Eckidulph Eccleston Quarry, Lancashire, 30 miles northwest of Manchester in England in October 1979, That was over me. Peter Williams QC flew over to England to defend Terry Clark and enlisted the help of Prince Philip, who ran most of the heroin in the world. Terry Clark was convicted of the murder and went to Parkhurst Prison on the Isle of Wight, then faked his death. A second-hand car dealership was then bought for Terry Clark in Perth, Australia. Greg Hallett went around to Peter William QC's house at 20 Pompelia Terrace in Ponsonby, Auckland, and told him this, and Peter Williams replied, "Yes, I have heard that." That's because he arranged it. Peter Williams QC arranged this from Terry Clark's 1.5 million New Zealand dollars in Peter Williams' safe in his house. The New Zealand Security Intelligence Service and Internal Affairs had commissioned Lennox to open Peter Williams' safe without a trace. That was Lennox's speciality. In exchange, he wasn't charged for some of his own robberies. Now, back to Centrepoint. Prime Minister Rob Muldoon and Bert Potter, the founder of Centrepoint, had the longest running court case in New Zealand regarding vermin, as in rats. This seemed to have never been resolved. The Centrepoint commune was founded by Bert Potter with Peter Eldridge Williams and Roger Douglas in the background. Roger Douglas tried to blame Centrepoint on me, Greg Hallett, using the corporate saboteur and Mossad asset Charlie Ward. But Greg Hallett was only 16 or 17 in 1978 and lived 5 hours drive away and was at school passing exams with no car and no mobile phone, which didn't exist then. Peter Eldridge Williams was a heroin trafficker, at least from the early 1960s, according to the New Zealand Army that spied on him, as relayed to New Zealand Internal Affairs and then to me in one of 1,000 briefings to which I took meticulous notes. Peter Eldridge Williams was then made Peter Williams QC and president of the Law Society. Other senior lawyers and judges refused to sit with him in their meetings at the Northern Club. This was the East India Club for New Zealand. It's still at 19 Princess Street, Auckland, 1010 on the corner of Kitchen Street. And it was Kitchener who murdered, it was Lord Jellicoe who murdered Lord Kitchener. And then Lord Jellicoe was sentenced, and his sentence was to become the Governor General of New Zealand in 1927. President of the Law Society, Peter Williams QC, had to come over to the table, at dinner, to the other lawyers' table, because no one would sit with him, and say, "Excuse me, gentlemen, do you mind if I join you?" So Peter Williams QC, president of the Law Society, was ostracised by the Law Society because they knew him to be a heroin trafficker and rampant murderer and a homosexual pedophile. Peter Williams QC was a heroin trafficker and Prince Philip's agent in New Zealand. Prince Philip was the biggest heroin trafficker the world has ever seen. This was confirmed by the British Royal Navy, who said they were sick of transporting heroin for Prince Philip. Oh, water. Page 3. I published this in 2007 in New Zealand Blackmailer's Guide. 2 disgruntled millionaires then paid 2 separate private investigators $100,000 each to investigate my, Greg Hallett's, claims in New Zealand Blackmailer's Guide. Both came back that it was 100% correct. This meant Greg Hallett had the highest sources of information, being the Security Intelligence Service and Internal Affairs. Internal Affairs was destroyed by Helen Clark in 1992-93 and became an organisation with no values, working towards no values, which is the Jesuit goal. The Jesuits co-adjusted feminism and communism to create a world of no values. Peter Williams QC confirmed the claims against him in the Disputes Tribunal, where he failed to pay me $6,000 for 2 building designs, and that was in the District Court, in the Disputes Tribunal, then in the District Court, and then in the High Court in Auckland in 2007 to 2011, when I was exposing Peter Williams as a homosexual pedophile and a heroin trafficker. So I'm exposing the president of the Law Society as a homosexual pedophile and a heroin trafficker. So cars got blown up, tsunamis, people got murdered. Seemed to be okay. Peter Williams' reply was that he was no longer an active homosexual. Peter Williams QC did not deny anything else. He did not deny that he was a heroin trafficker and did not deny that he was a pedophile. It was a defamation case and I won the case, but they couldn't approve that. So they weaponized the courts, and Judge Stevens removed all of my 699 pages of evidence, including Peter Williams' bank details of heroin trafficking payments and property transfers, buying a house for $3,000 and selling it for $300,000 by removing the full stop. This laundered $297,000. The witnessing lawyer went to jail for it, and when he got out, Peter Williams bought him the Empire Tavern on the corner of Victoria Street West and Nelson Street for $1 million. Judge Stevens then told me I, Greg Hallett, was going to have to appeal to the High Court and go to the Court of Appeal just to see my own evidence. Ditto for anyone else. That's how much they wanted to suppress it. Judge Stevens then had his secretary write up a single page and submit this to his own court as though I had written it, and then threw my case out based on lack of evidence. Although Peter Williams QC had admitted to being a homosexual, not denied he was a pedophile, and not denied he was a heroin trafficker, and not denied he was running Terry Clark, the convicted heroin trafficker, his client, who was also run by Prince Philip. In the process to scare me off in 2009, the same group killed 2,000 people as a human sacrifice, then recorded this as a couple of hundred people. With the aid of Prime Minister John Key and the New Zealand Air Force and New Zealand Navy, they planted an underwater bomb in the earthquake fault at Western Samoa as per Operation Sea Lion, which was mooted and tested in 1945, and blew up the fault early on Tuesday morning, 29th of September 2009. This caused a tidal wave, killing 850 Samoans and another 1,150 Indonesians 24 hours later. The quote, "The deadly 2009 tsunami was triggered by at least two separate earthquakes occurring within 2 to 3 minutes of each other near the Tonga Trench, one of the most seismically active areas in the world. This is an extremely rare event known as a doublet," end quote, because the Operation Sea Lion explosion caused the earthquake, so it registered as two earthquakes. The size of the wave was 14 meters. My child was the target. She was out on a Fale open-sided house on stilts over the water, ran, got through the hotel welcome gate, turned around and looked, and was swamped by the rapid, dirty water. She reports the wave was 4 meters high, not 14 meters, and traveling at 40 kilometers per hour. The New Zealand Herald front page then had her pink suitcase centre shot amongst all the wreckage, as if they were telling me to back off from exposing them as laundering Prince Philip and Peter Williams' heroin trafficking money, which they were all of 1970 to 1980. The New Zealand Herald had gone to Jewish lawyers in the USA for advice, which was, quote, "Human sacrifice is the best distraction we've come up with for laundering money. Do a mass human sacrifice and sell the story. That way you can't lose." End citation. It was the New Zealand Herald that had laundered the heroin trafficking money run by Peter Williams QC and Prince Philip and Roger Douglas and many other MPs. The Auckland Star exposed Peter Williams' heroin trafficking as the misnamed Mr. Asia Heroin Trafficking Syndicate. As a result, the Auckland Star, 1870 to 1991, is no more, closing in 1991, 12 years after exposing the heroin trafficker Terry Clark, who was Peter Williams QC's client. Peter Williams QC's junior lawyer, Karen Sowich, was the live-in girlfriend of the heroin trafficker Terry Clark, and Peter Williams was storing Terry Clark's profits in his safe in his house, as discovered by Lennox, working for the Security Intelligence Service. Why do I have so much interest in this? Why do I know so much about this? Because the heroin was targeted at me as the Chief of the Ordinaries and Sovereign of New Zealand by at least 3 different avenues. But the heroin didn't get to me. It got to my 3 siblings. However, the 2 sisters are unlikely relatives and more likely Prince Philip's Plunkett plants. While investigating this, I even played tennis and went sailing with Peter Williams, thinking he was the president of the Law Society. I was later to find out he was head of the heroin trafficking syndicate, which was aimed at me, and the mafia boss. Quote, "The 8.3 magnitude quake struck on Tuesday, 5:48 a.m., 29th of September 2009, their local time Samoa, generating a 15-foot, 4.5-metre wave in some areas of the islands. The whole half of the south coast was hit by this massive tsunami. Separately, on Wednesday, the 30th of September 2009, a 7.9 magnitude earthquake struck a different fault line off the Indonesian island of Sumatra, killing at least 75 people. It actually killed 1,150 people. And it wasn't a separate fault line. Those two fault lines are absolutely connected. And that is sourced from, on this day, 2009, Samoa Island Tsunami, National Centres for Environmental Information, 29 September 2009, and BBC News, Deadly Tsunami Strikes in Pacific, Wednesday, 30 September. See on page 3, it's 26 degrees, so I'm going to have a little drink. Here's the view. There it is. I'm inside the church kind of foyer at the moment, just to get some shade. So, sheet 4. This Sumatra fault line is connected to Samoa and always goes off within 40 hours. So another 1,150 people were killed 24 hours later in Sumatra, rendering 2,000 dead in 24 hours in 2009. New Zealand Prime Minister John Key, 2008 to 2016, had got Samoa's Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister out of Western Samoa the day before by inviting them to lunch in Parliament buildings in Wellington, New Zealand. The meeting and the lunch had no agenda. There was nothing to discuss. According to Internal Affairs, the absolutely ruthless Peter Eldridge Williams QC and the equally ruthless Minister of Broadcasting Roger Douglas were behind the Centrepoint commune, with Bert Potter running it. Both were homosexual pedophiles. Bert Potter was a pedophile and a government asset who was always allowed to plead independence from the New Zealand government. The New Zealand government never raised that Bert Potter was catch and release and a New Zealand government asset. Centrepoint had been running from 1978 for 13 years when Bert Potter was charged with pedophilia in 1991 or 2. Greg Hallett was there 10 years earlier as a 19 to 20-year-old while also at Auckland University. He was living there with his girlfriend who won an American Field Service scholarship and went to Ohio in North America for a year. Kate ended up appearing on New Zealand's TV1 complaining about Centrepoint and Bert Potter, and rightly so. The New Zealand government did nothing for the children of Centrepoint because Centrepoint was a government operation. The New Zealand government was late in exposing the pedophilia of Bert Potter and the pedophilia of Centrepoint because they didn't want to expose the pedophilia of Peter Williams QC, who died in 2016, and Roger Douglas, who's now 85 and was convicted of pedophilia in 1999 by his stepson, for which he was given a traffic ticket and a knighthood. To delay this exposure, Peter Williams QC and Roger Douglas installed Taffy Walsh as the Takapuna Area Police Commander. Takapuna covered the North Shore, being a third of Auckland. Taffy Walsh was having sex with 2 of his granddaughters in the executive toilet of the Takapuna Area Police Station and was charged, convicted and sentenced for it. When he appealed, he was sentenced again. Taffy Walsh had no interest in catching pedophiles at Centrepoint. Rather, the Takapuna Area Police Commander, Taffy Walsh, had a vested interest in supplying children to Peter Eldridge Williams QC and the MP Roger Douglas, Minister of Broadcasting and then Minister of Finance. Peter Williams had also run the murders of Harvey and Jeanette Crew in June 1970 with his live-in business partner Winston Peters, born in 1945, who was questioned by the police over the double murder in 1970. Winston Peters was a lawyer and drug narc at the time and wanted in with the heroin trafficking and had to prove himself. A double murder will do that. To cover for his double murders, Winston Peters was given his own political party, New Zealand First, which started in 1993 at the same time as the Centrepoint hearings. Winston Peters was then made Kingmaker and Deputy Prime Minister 2017 to 20 for complete cover. There was always 4 internal affairs agents and at least 1 security intelligence service agent living at Centrepoint. This means that any pedophilia was monitored. This means the government knew about any and all of the pedophilia from its inception. This means the government did nothing about it and let it continue because it It was members of the New Zealand government and judiciary who were having sex with the children, and they eventually blamed this on the Takapuna Police Commander Taffy Walsh and elder members of Centrepoint, both of whom were guilty or possibly guilty or part of the New Zealand $100 million setup, the landgrab con. Some of these convictions were a total surprise to me. This was due to the influence of victims being funded to make claims under feminism, which is itself a pedophile movement led by the KGB gangbang prostitute Helen Clark and her homosexual child sex abusing husband Peter Davis, who lectures to medical students at Auckland University, and they complain to me that they just hate this. Helen Clark was leader of the opposition at the time, 1993 to 99, and became Prime Minister in 1999 to 2008 because the incumbent Prime Minister, Jenny Shipley, 1997 to 99, was a rampant murderer, and her illegitimate daughter had confessed to multiple murders and beheadings in Sydney and had just been convicted and was doing time for double murder. So Jenny Shipley's daughter was going around with her taxi driver boyfriend and shooting gays in parks with bows and arrows, taking them home, sticking them in the freezer, and then cutting their arms and legs and heads off, putting those in the wheelie bin, and then getting weights and attaching that to the torso and dumping them in the harbour. And those torsos with weights attached were showing up in the extreme low tides, spring low tides. Prime Minister Jenny Shipley was the second biggest murderer in New Zealand's history after an old lady in a small beachside house between Milford and Takapuna who invited many tradesmen to work on a house. Then she'd come up behind them with a bolster and whacked them over the head until dead. Jenny Shipley was about 80. It was about 82 murders, and she was actually about 82 at the time that they discovered it, and they thought that she was too old to take to court and convict, so they just let it go and buried it. Jenny Shipley gave her contract killer, Kimball Johnson, rapid cancer, so Kimball Johnson briefed us in a 3-story house at the top of Parnell, Auckland, just before he died. Jenny Shipley then killed his sister with rapid cancer 6 months later. Prime Minister Helen Clark was also a murderer and a heroin trafficker for NATO and stored a nuclear weapon for the African National Congress, then sold it, keeping the money, all the while claiming to be anti-nuclear. Helen Clark also sunk the Lermontov passenger liner on the 16th of February 1986, then sabotaged the rescue mission, almost killing 372 passengers and 348 crew, 720 in total, but only killing one Russian, probably KGB agent, although allowing 52 KGB agents to fall off the boat and infect New Zealand. Trafficking heroin to become Prime Minister. Roger Douglas, born 1937, was Postmaster General 1972 to 74, Minister of Broadcasting 1972 to 75, Minister of Housing 1974 to 75, Minister of Customs in 1975, Minister of Revenue 1984 to 87, and Minister of Finance 1984 to 88. He's most known for being Minister of Finance, and his policies resulted in the suicides of at least 200 farmers. David Lange was the Prime Minister of New Zealand 1984 to 89. Roger Douglas was his right-hand man. Page 5. Crap. David Lange and Roger Douglas used to go to Ohakea Air Base, 22 kilometres northwest of Palmerston North in the central North Island. This was the closest place to Australia. Bob Hawke, and it's very remote, so if you flew into Ohakea Air Base from Australia, it was very likely that no one actually saw the plane. Bob Hawke was the Prime Minister of Australia in 1983 to 91, and Paul John Keating, born in 1944, was the leader of the opposition from April 1990 to June 1991, and was to become Prime Minister of Australia 1991 to 96. Most of the heroin was known as the Queen's heroin, and no one could be charged for the Queen's heroin. In the Commonwealth countries, the leader of the opposition who trafficked the Queen's heroin became Prime Minister. I'll read that again. In the Commonwealth countries, the leader of the opposition who trafficked the Queen's heroin became Prime Minister. When the leader of the opposition trafficked more heroin than the Prime Minister, he became Prime Minister. Snap election. This was the case with Bob Hawke and Paul Keating, whose wife was the second richest woman in the USA, so extremely ambitious. Bob Hawke was looking towards retirement and so lent his Air Force One plane to Paul Keating to accompany the Queen's heroine to Ohakea Air Base, where they were met by the opposition Labour leader David Longy, February 83 to 84, July 84, and Roger Douglas, who was between portfolios between 1975 and 84, while he focused on child drug trafficking. David Longy was into sex with transvestites, where he was filmed at the Duck Pond in the Auckland Domain. The male prostitute was then killed just outside Sydney's King's Cross. He was stabbed and left behind a dumpster, courtesy of ASIO, the Australian Security and Intelligence Service Organisation. The scenario of the Queen's heroine, who actually ASIO then told David Longy that had done it, David Longy broke down in tears. And then ASIO ran New Zealand for quite a while, and including those who read the news and had radio shows. You know who I mean. This scenario of the Queen's heroine flying from Australia to the Ohakea Air Base in westernmost New Zealand and picked up by the want-to-be Prime Minister went on for decades in the 1970s, 1980s and 1990s, so their titles may have changed and been upgraded or downgraded according to the amount of the Queen's heroine they distributed. Anyway, in this instance being reported, because it's used in intelligence Christmas parties as a wind down, Paul Keating landed at the Ohakea Air Base with a plane load of the Queen's heroine and refused to get out of Australia's Air Force One as the plane offered diplomatic immunity. So David Longy, who was 26 stone at least, he's extremely fat. He actually fell through the floorboards of the Otahuhu court because he used to stand in front of the judge, just huge stomach, like you wouldn't believe it. He used to stand in front of the judge eating M&Ms all the time, talking to the judge. And then he ate one too many M&Ms and the floor gave way and collapsed, timber floor, and he actually sunk into the floor. So his legs were below the floorboards and his belly was resting on the floor. Yeah, very funny. So David Longy and Roger Douglas had to climb on board the Australia's Air Force One to carry the heroine off the plane, while Paul Keating looked away, crumpled up into a fetal position in his suit. Roger Douglas, Minister of Broadcasting, 8 December 1972 to December 1975, was supplying drugs to Radio I, adult drugs for adults, and marijuana, cannabis, and Buddha sticks to children as young as 9 from 1969, even 1968. Barbara Allpress worked in broadcasting and at Radio I and used to bring the cannabis home to Onipoto Bridge, Northcote, where they had the old farmhouse there straight after the bridge. Bring the cannabis home for her eldest son, Michael Allpress, who was just 9 years old, to distribute to other children, followed by her second son, Peter Allpress, by the time he turned 11. And my brother Nick, aged 9, was targeted to be a drug dealer, and all his school exams were failed. He wasn't very bright anyway, but he failed everything. Failed school seat twice. Girls used to chase him like an episode of Benny Hill in the same time frame, 1969 to 89. They literally did. Like, we had the house on the corner of the school, so we overlooked the fields, and he'd come back from lunch at home and he'd walk across the fields, and there'd literally be 10 girls chasing him. Just Benny Hill stuff. Roger Douglas was trafficking drugs to school children, although Barbara Allpress was using her son, Michael Allpress. As cover, Michael Allpress became a born-again Christian, attending those big monolith churches on Sundays. Then in 1989, age 30, began importing coffee from the cocaine countries in South America. Coffee is the best way to hide cocaine. It's the smell of it covers it. Michael Allpress expanded into Australia, Japan, Singapore, and the UK, which were also hotspots for cocaine use, and sold on 30th of April 2021 to Asahi, ASAHI, supplying 1,500 tonnes and 120 million cups of coffee a year, with revenues of 25 million New Zealand dollars a year. Who says child drug trafficking doesn't pay? Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern from October 2017 to January 2023. Methamphetamine trafficker. The two drug traffickers, Roger Douglas, born 1937, and Michael Allpress, born 1958, were both appointed advisors to Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, 2017 to 23, who was a methamphetamine manufacturer and trafficker. Jacinda Ardern became the biggest methamphetamine manufacturer and trafficker in New Zealand by importing a jailbird from Europe who was doing 60 years for methamphetamine manufacture. This actually made the news and there were protests over it. Jacinda Ardern got him out of prison and brought him to New Zealand to manufacture methamphetamine drugs for her because he was the best in the world. It's water. Methamphetamine superseded the Queen's heroin as the means to become Prime Minister because they were more profitable. Even Prince Charles agreed. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern's boyfriend, husband, Clark Gaylord, was twice before a court judge for methamphetamine dealing. So his name was changed from Gaylord to Gay Ford, and the press were bribed by the new multi-million-dollar voluntary access slush fund, whereby the press could take whatever it wanted, not to publish anything about Clark Gaylord or Clark Gayford's methamphetamine dealing and Jacinda Ardern's methamphetamine manufacture and trafficking. This is all about creating a world with no values, which is the Jesuit formula to steal all the sovereignty of the world and to leave you with nothing and happy for it because you have access to their drugs, then you die. The Jesuit Prince Charles was also comfortably behind this. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern and Clark Gaylord Gayford then went to Queen Elizabeth II's funeral on Monday the 19th of September 2022. Then 9 months later, on Monday the 5th of June 2023, Jacinda Ardern was made Dame Grand Companion of the New Zealand Order of Merit for drug trafficking the new preferred and more profitable Windsor drug, methamphetamines, and the same day, Camilla Parker Bowles was made Order of New Zealand for being the centre of the 2004 Northern Bank robbery, where her ex-husband organised the robbery, her brother organised the money laundering, and her new husband Charles organised the cover-up. And both Camilla and Charles became the royal patrons for Elephant Family, which laundered the £23.5 million to pay off the alternative media to act as corporate saboteurs to bear false witness against any truther. I'll just read that again. Camilla and Charles became the royal patrons for Elephant Family, which laundered the £23.5 million to pay off all alternative media to act as corporate saboteurs to bear false witness against any truther. Hence, M-Seeker of Truth Justice, Mark Craythorne, who's Mark Windsor, who's Mark Alexander Scott, all fronting as Mark Windows, and Dave Mahoney, Charlie Ward, and Rice Crypto, who's fronting for Chris Reese. These are all corporate saboteurs. Charles Hanstein, not Windsor, not Saxe Coburg and Gotha, not Saxon Coburg and Gotha, was king for a day, actually 3 days. Then it went to the chair of the estate, which is Rothschild. Prince Charles Hanstein may be the son of Jacob Rothschild, born in 1936 and worth $6 billion. So he would have been 21 in Prince Charles' conception. Prince Charles Hanstein has 5 illegitimate children. William and Harry are not his and make up for 2 of his illegitimate children. Prince Charles Hanstein is such a non-royal, not even his wife would breed with him. Alternative media corporate saboteur Charlie Ward bears false witness for Prince Charles. Charlie Ward, excuse me. Charlie Ward is an identity thief. Stole my identity. All my material and then turned it into rubbish. Charlie Ward then had Roger Douglas and Paul Gagan on the show in 2020. They had volunteered to attack Greg Hallett in support of Prince Charles covering up their pedophilia. Charlie Ward refused to expose Roger Douglas as a heroin trafficking child rapist and Paul Gagan as the head of the Catholic Inquisition in New Zealand, covering up for the incestuous pedophilia of Grant Aisleby against his daughter Caroline, then aged 9. The two Catholic Freemasons from the same lodge both live in Tauranga now and both provide cover for Catholic pedophiles, including each other, over the barbecue. Grant Aisleby actually used to hide in my house. When I came home from school and got off my bike, he'd run across the house, open the ranch sliders and look out and look at my ass getting off the school bike. And then he drunk my father to death over about 8 years. He was about 12 years younger. And then he spoke at the funeral and said, he's dead. I mean, the guy's a sociopath. He's got no empathy. So Grant Aislby's a Catholic, incestuous pedophile, and he's a corporate saboteur, bears false witness. Employment is never direct and usually goes through an agency like Cambridge Analytica or a subsidiary like David Mahoney's corporate sabotage counterintelligence entity, PIR. In this way, Dave Mahoney's a convicted drug trafficker on catch and release. He's caught trafficking cocaine, flying it from Colombia into the United States of America. And he's involved in real estate frauds in North America. So he's banned from North America. And he's involved in real estate frauds in Spain, selling timeshares in Brazil on land you couldn't build on. So one guy complained to me and he lost 100,000 euros to Dave Mahoney selling a fraud. In this way, the heroin trafficking convicted pedophile Roger Douglas was able to engage the corporate saboteur with name suppressed but called M Seeker of Truth, working through the alternative media and PIR to bear false witness. M Seeker of Truth is more M Denial of Truth. M Seeker of Truth, M Denial of Truth engaged Rick Marshall, who was secretary for Roger Douglas's ACT Party, and Prince Philip's Plunkett plant Amanda Pink was charged and sentenced with reckless endangerment in 2009 for driving into a crowd of people outside a pub in Southend-on-Sea in London. She tried to drive through the people and into the front doors, trying to drive into the pub to get more punters for her own gangbang. She's an alcoholic, heroin user, heavy drug user. She'd rolled 3 cars by the age of 20. Alcoholic, absolute whore, and possessed, massively possessed. Amanda Pink is a possessed heroin-using alcoholic, one of Prince Philip's Plunkett plants, placed into a family to cause maximum disruption. Amanda Pink is possessed, a witch, absolutely is, she even looks like one, and was kicked out of the family age 14 when I was 12 for attempted murder of me after stabbing herself in the eye with a knitting needle and then trying to stab a 12-year-old me in the forehead with a pair of dressmaking scissors. Prince Philip always picks the worst, and this was The Exorcist in action at the same time as the movie came out. So when you guys were watching The Exorcist, it was like happening to me in real time. Tam Hallett, the so-called sister, is a semi-retarded, low IQ, low EQ lesbian who blames anyone for anything she can, so heterosexuals avoid her like the plague. She'll blame any heterosexual male for anything. You made me do it. Really. Tam Hallett has no redeeming features and event stuff in her head, like going to Centrepoint and hearing a 4-year-old girl walking around asking anyone and everyone for sex. Tam Hallett never went to Centrepoint. Tam Hallett is a compulsive liar and always has been. It was a tragedy to have her in the same household, and this was Prince Philip causing maximum disruption. 4. Amanda Pink and Tam Hallett were Prince Philip's Plunkett plants, replacing a couple of stillborns. This helped cover the mortgage. They were selected for the maximum disruption they would cause. Amanda Pink and Tam Hallett were known as those lying Hallett sisters. This is what M Seeker of Truth was working with in order to create M Denial of Truth for the heroin trafficking convicted pedophile Roger Douglas and the head of the Catholic Inquisition in New Zealand, Paul Gagan, whom I beat in the family court. Paul Gagan was trying to steal my daughter for his Catholic pedophile ring, which included Grant Aisleby, who I exposed as an incestuous pedophile after Grant Aisleby confessed to this in our house in April-May 1986. My mother was his confessor. Just to clarify, page and a half. I have no relationship with John Potter, and my girlfriend did not marry him. She married Mike, not Terry, and I was their best man. Terry and John built all the board and batten buildings at Centrepoint. Terry was part Fijian, wore a Fijian rugby jersey, was an Aikido instructor, and was inseparable from John. They were often photographed together and even photographed meditating together. The photos M. Seeker of Truth presented of Greg Hallett and Centrepoint were of Terry. They were not of me. There are no photos of me at Centrepoint. None. The two ugly Hallett sisters, known as those lying Hallett sisters, are more likely Prince Philip's Plunkett plants, orphans chosen for their evil, bearing false witness, witches, at the same time as The Exorcist 1973 and The Omen 1976. Last page, page 7 or 14. Amanda Pink was kicked out of the family in 1973, the same time as The Exorcist, for possession and attempted murder, stabbing with a pair of dressmaking scissors. Everyone forgot about her. She tried to return 10 years later and was kicked out of home once again. The younger sister, Tam Hallett, had one speciality: staring into space with nothing happening and making this contagious. She was a non-entity. I avoided them both as much as I could, which was all the time, with minor exceptions. I almost never spoke to them. They were junkies, alcoholics, and whores. There's no other words for it. They were the lowest of the low. Their friends were ugly mental patients and drug addicts who dropped their car wrecks in our backyard and left them for 9 months, never fixing them. As such, none of the photos presented by my non-sisters were actually of me, and none of the things my non-sisters presented were things I had done. They simply never knew me. For instance, when I got an architecture degree, they thought I was a truck driver because they'd made it up in their heads. And no family member turned up for the graduation, not even the ones that lived in Auckland. They were all wasted on Prince Philip's drugs, who had been targeting them. It's actually targeting me, but it got to them. It was Deborah and Peter who exposed the Centrepoint pedophilia to the police. It was not the Internal Affairs agents living at Centrepoint, nor the Security Intelligence Service agent living at Centrepoint, nor the Takapuna Area Police, nor Roger Douglas, nor Peter Williams. It was Deborah, who was an ex-girlfriend of Eric Clapton, and her boyfriend Peter, who was also a really good guitarist and had connections to North America. Greg Hallett lived at Centrepoint aged 19 and 20 for exactly a year while still going to architecture school at Auckland University. I did this because I was dissatisfied with my upbringing, especially the two non-sisters, also because it was $60 a week for room and board, and you had to work 4 hours on Saturdays doing a bit of work in the glass house gardens. And my girlfriend lived there. She was the niece of the president of Federated Farmers, Sir Peter Elworthy, whose midnight snack was poisoned, killing him on the 11th of January 2004. I was actually the one that got the information from Internal Affairs about the snack being poisoned, and then I told the family, and then they checked, and they said, yes, he did have a midnight snack every night, piece of cake. So I spent Sundays in the library at Centrepoint with the psychologist studying the latest psychologies 2.5 years to 3 years ahead of the high street. And within a year of leaving Centrepoint in 1982-83, Coca-Cola came out to New Zealand and made me the drink and wink for Coke, mainly because I owned New Zealand and North America, but didn't realise this yet. North America had been passed down to me via Sir Walter Raleigh and Marquess of Pembroke. The psychology I learned at Centrepoint would have helped me deal with the CIA and the KGB during the Cold War in North America. It was in Boston, it was in New York, it was in Washington, D.C., and I was in New Haven, Connecticut. North America, Greece, Turkey, East Berlin, West Berlin, Budapest, Moscow, and London, and the fall of the Berlin Wall. So by the time I got back to New Zealand, it was communist, and I was persona non grata. Hence, I was not allowed to be celebrated as a hero, but rather to be silenced for knowing this and many other background stories. Instead of being celebrated, I was attacked by draftsmen as, Greg Hallett lived at Centrepoint. I should have been celebrated as a hero for exposing Centrepoint as a government operation. Obviously, these draftsmen catch and release corporate saboteurs. M. Seeker of the Truth was really in denial of truth and denied and relied on these two non-sisters to bear false witness according to the corporate sabotage of my 2004 5-volume set, The Hidden King of England. They got nothing right, nothing, not even the photos. This corporate sabotage was funded by Prince Charles from the Northern Bank robbery as organised by Camilla Parker Bowles, who runs Charles as a shill for her family's money laundering operations. On the upside, North America and international golfing champion Arnold Palmer, 1929 to 2016, used to come around to our house in Auckland and Tauranga for barbecues. He was a trained observer for the fulfillment of prophecies. Once a beer was placed in his hand, he used to just stand back and observe. He enjoyed this. I was a teenager and at university at the time, aged between 11 and 24. Arnold Palmer was the instigator, then sent Coca-Cola from North America to New Zealand, who selected me for the drink and wink for Coke in 1982-83. Then Arnold Palmer followed up as a trained observer to see how things were progressing. The big training was in 1980, a year before I went to Centrepoint. Centrepoint was actually a place for me to rest up, protected by the hordes, 150 or so. M. Seeker, and I had a really good body double there in Terry. Thanks, Terry. M. Seeker of Truth teamed up with Rice Crypto of Rice TV, Chris Rice of the Rice-Reese family in North Carolina. He still hasn't supplied an address, and he's still a psilocybin addict mushroom head with dilated pupils, even during his interviews. M. Seeker of Truth and Rice Crypto are both corporate saboteurs using false names with no address. They have no qualifications and no work history. Both work with the corporate saboteurs Charlie Ward and Dave McPhoney, for Prince Charles, funded by the Northern Bank robbery through Elephant Family money laundering, founded by Camilla's brother, who was killed in New York in April 2014. By interviewing the two non-sisters, Amanda Pink and Tam Hallett, both compulsive liars and catch and release for using Prince Philip's heroin and for reckless endangerment, driving into a crowd in Southend, these corporate saboteurs reduced my funding from an income, which lasted 2 weeks, to nothing. So for 2 weeks I got 400 quid a week, and then I got nothing. It was the sharpest bell curve in history. This is libel. All the above named are required to supply their full names and address for discovery. If you've got any questions, any information, leave them in the comments. And you can get my ebooks from kingjohn3rd.uk. Enjoy.